From bats, rats and even the humble chicken, diseases from animals to humans are on the rise. Now, this parasitic roundworm is the latest to make the leap from snakes, finding its way into the brain of a 64-year-old Australian woman.
It was wriggling vigorously like it wanted to get back to its home, and when we put it into the path pot, it was continuing to try and wriggle away, so it was just very alive. This is where it was, right here in the right frontal lobe. And you can
Neurosurgeon Dr Hari Priyabandi was the doctor who found the worm while operating on the woman's brain at Canberra Hospital.
Right frontal lobe is the area of the brain that's responsible for emotions and responding to our environment and regulating how we feel. And we know the few months prior to this being discovered in her brain, she was feeling out of control.
Carpet pythons are the usual host for this worm, known as Ophidascaris robertsi. But how did this parasite jump from snakes to humans?
This is the first time that this particular parasite, Ophidascaris robertsi, complicated name, has been found to infect a human being.
The worm lives in pythons, with the snake excreting the eggs in its poo. Mammals, such as rats, become the intermediate host, ingesting the faeces and eggs, which hatch into larvae. Pythons then eat the rats, which continues the life cycle. The woman became an accidental host after it's believed she ate a commonly foraged plant contaminated with python faeces.
She'd seen carpet pythons in her roof and around her house, and there was a description that she also ate warrigal greens, which is in that area as well.
Scientists believe it's likely she had picked the contaminated warrigal greens near her home and became sick.
It's python poo on top of the warrigal greens, and she's taken that, washed it and prepared it as far as she's concerned appropriately, but maybe not quite enough.
They say the case is yet another example of the threat of zoonotic diseases as humans encroach on the environment.
About 75% of the new or emerging infections in the world are zoonotic, so it's a lot. This case also illustrates how animal infections are transmitting more easily into the human world because of our proximity to each other. So domestic animals mixing with wild animals, humans mixing with wild animals, and the vegetation involved. So we are going to see more of these kinds of infections.
A segment of the worm has been saved with the CSIRO for future research into emerging infections.
As we move into the environment of animals, we are bound to interact with aspects of the organisms that live in or on them.
David Spratt is an expert in parasites and identified the worm straight away when doctors showed him a photo.
I know what this is.
Even in the human body, he says, the parasite is resilient.
Let's say it's hatched in stomach or intestine, and so we've then got a third stage larva within the tissues, the organ tissues, but this is where it's so active. It'll be wandering perhaps through the liver, up through the lungs, back down to the intestine, all around inside the body, and hence it can move on and arrive at the brain. It's just a very, very active larva.
While this parasite is extremely rare in humans, a different worm has affected food production in Hawaii.
A newlywed California couple is sharing its honeymoon horror story. Turns out they both contracted rat lungworm disease.
Rat lungworm is a parasite that lives in rats and spreads when snails or slugs come into contact with rat faeces. Humans can become infected after eating food contaminated with snails or slugs. Rat lungworm can also travel to the brain and cause meningitis.
This has shown that particular parasitic infections become established there. It's now notifiable in Hawaii because they want to keep an understanding about numbers and make sure their surveillance is really good.
Warrigal greens grow in locations like this, and the trees by the water usually grow in cities, in urban and peri-urban environments.
As foraging for food becomes more popular, expert forager Diego Benetto says pickers should be alert but not alarmed.
My advice for people who feel scared about going out and harvesting wild greens is wash it. Take them home, wash them.
Wash, boil, broil, whatever you need to do.
And despite her ordeal, doctors say the woman who had the worm in her brain is doing much better.
To measure, she doesn't have any residual deficits because of it. That feeling of not being in control has improved, and she doesn't have any other brain worms elsewhere.